The farmer never expected his plough to strike bone. The year was 1829, and the Delaware soil had hidden something it was never meant to give back. At first he thought it was the rotted stump of a tree, but when he cleared the dirt with his hands, what emerged was the skull of a man. Not just a man, but one beaten, broken, and buried alive in silence. His jaw cracked, his eye sockets shattered, his body discarded in a wooden chest, like property, like cargo, like nothing at all. And this was no accident, no isolated act of cruelty. It was the opening crack in a vault of horrors that had been sealed for decades, a vault belonging to one woman, a woman who shattered every notion of female fragility, a woman who fed on human lives the way others fed on bread. Her name? Patty Cannon, the woman who hunted African Americans. Understand this. She wasn't just a murderer. She wasn't just a trafficker. She was the queen of a hidden economy, a reverse underground railroad. At a time when the South was starving for labor after the ban on importing enslaved Africans, she turned freedom itself into a hunting ground. Her prey? Free black men, women and children living in the thin, precarious safety of the northern border states. She built a machine that fed their bodies into the cotton fields of Alabama, Mississippi and Georgia. But she didn't just sell people, she extinguished them, witnesses, rivals, children who cried too loud in the night. Her empire was built not just on commerce, but on bones. And here's the truth they never want you to see. Patty Cannon's story isn't just history. It's a template, a living manual for how power hides itself, how corruption thrives when law turns its head, how entire systems profit from the silence of the vulnerable. Every institution, from local sheriffs to businessmen in Philadelphia to plantation owners in the Deep South, was either feeding G from her hand or looking the other way, because she revealed something fundamental about America, that the system was never built to protect the weak. It was designed to consume them, and once you see that, you can't unsee it. So tonight I'm taking you into her world, into the taverns where children screamed in chains, into the cellars where free men lost their names, into the dark corridors of a woman who turned freedom itself into bait. But understand this, once you step inside, you can't climb back out. This is forbidden knowledge, the kind that brands you forever. The land around Patty Cannon's empire was not a neutral backdrop. It was her accomplice. The border of Delaware and Maryland, where she built her stronghold, was more than just geography. It was a labyrinth of loopholes, shadows, and escape routes. Imagine it, a crossroads where three counties collided, each with their own laws, each with their own sheriffs, none willing or able to chase a criminal across the invisible lines carved by politics. One step to the left, you were in Delaware. One step to the right, Maryland. To the men who hunted justice, it was a nightmare. To Patty Cannon, it was paradise. The forests here were ancient, thick with oak and pine, their branches tangling together like clasped fingers determined to hide what lay beneath. Marshlands stretched for miles, swallowing footprints and muffling the sound of wagons dragging human cargo under cover of night. The Nanticoke River wound through this region like a serpent, offering secret passage to the Chesapeake and beyond. If lawmen pursued, they were slowed by mud, by distance, by terrain that seemed to protect her more fiercely than any army. It was as though the earth itself conspired with her. But nature was only one layer of her camouflage. The deeper truth was this: the people around her chose blindness. Her neighbors saw wagons arriving at midnight, heard muffled screams rising from beneath floorboards, witnessed the sudden vanishings of black families, but they said nothing. Silence was cheaper than conflict. Silence was safer than justice. And silence kept their pockets full, because her money flowed like poisoned water. Merchants sold her supplies without asking questions. Officials took bribes in exchange for their indifference. Even preachers, the supposed shepherds of morality, kept their sermons carefully neutral, so long as their own families were left untouched. This is the truth humanity never meant to see. Power doesn't need to hide in the shadows when it can teach entire communities to look away. Evil thrives not only in the actions of the wicked, but in the obedience of the ordinary. Patty Cannon didn't act alone. She was carried by a tide of passive accomplices, a tide of neighbors who traded their conscience for comfort, a tide of institutions that knew her crimes, yet preferred to pretend otherwise. And in that silence, her fortress grew. It wasn't just the wood of her tavern walls or the chains hidden beneath her cellar floors. Her true fortress was made of complicity, and once a society chooses complicity, There is no limit to how far the darkness will spread. At first glance, Patty Cannon's home looked like any other on the Delaware-Maryland border, a modest two-story structure of timber and brick, its windows small, its roof weathered by rain and wind. To a traveler, it was nothing more than another rural homestead, unremarkable, harmless. But that was the illusion. The walls of this house were not walls of comfort, they were walls of confinement. They were engineered to hide human cargo like contraband, as though lives could be folded away like contraband tobacco. This was not a home. It was a hunting lodge, a warehouse of flesh. Step inside and you would smell the sourness of damp wood, but beneath it, something worse. Sweat, fear, the human scent of too many bodies packed into spaces too small for air to flow. Beneath the main floor, hidden behind false walls and trapdoors, Patty Cannon had constructed secret chambers, narrow rooms where people were chained in the dark, waiting to be moved like livestock. Neighbors said the floors carried strange vibrations at night, as if the earth itself groaned. But when asked, they looked away. Some pretended the sounds were rats, others prayed the screams were dreams. Those who survived her house described it as a place where time disintegrated, days vanished into darkness. A man could enter on a Monday and lose his name by Friday. Papers proving freedom were stripped away, burned, destroyed, their real identities erased and replaced with lies, new names, new origins, forged stories that would allow Southern planters to purchase them without doubt. Imagine the psychological violence of that theft. To know your body was chained was one thing, to know your history was burned alive was something far worse. And children were the most vulnerable, too young to resist, too small to escape. Many were held in the Cannon home for weeks, their crying punished with silence, their hunger ignored until submission replaced resistance. If a child cried too long, too loud, Patty solved the problem herself. Some were never sold, some never left that house alive. Their bodies were buried in the soil, their bones later unearthed by accident. The Cannon home was a slaughterhouse disguised as a farmhouse. But here's the truth you must face. Her house was not unique. Across America, in basements, attics, and barns, hidden rooms were built to conceal what society chose to deny. Power always builds its prisons inside ordinary walls, trusting that no one will dare to look too closely. Evil rarely grows alone. It recruits, it infects, it spreads like a contagion through bloodlines and marriages until an entire family becomes its scaffolding. Patty Cannon understood this instinctively. She didn't just build an empire of crime, she bred it. Her own daughter's husbands became her lieutenants, their lives woven into the same tapestry of deceit and blood. The first was Henry Brereton, a blacksmith. On the surface, a man of tools and iron, shaping horseshoes for neighbors and earning his bread honestly. But his hammer struck more than metal, it struck chains. He used his mobility, his excuse to travel, to scout victims. He knew which free black families had children nearing adulthood. He knew which men could bring the highest price in a southern auction. Brereton kidnapped in daylight, pretending it was business, and when he was finally caught, locked in a Delaware jail for his crimes, he escaped with uncanny ease. It was after that escape when the family's first known murder was committed. A rival slave trader, shot, robbed, buried on Cannon land. The line had been crossed. It was no longer just kidnapping, it was killing for profit. But even death didn't break the chain. When Brereton was hanged in 1813, Patty Cannon's daughter remarried, and this second husband, Joseph Johnson, was far more dangerous. He wasn't just a brute with a gun, he was a businessman, a strategist. He saw that kidnappings could be scaled like an industry. He saw that their tavern, perched directly on the Delaware-Maryland border, could be weaponized, a building where one side of a room was Delaware, the other Maryland. When lawmen came with warrants, suspects stepped a few feet across the floor and claimed immunity. Johnson's Tavern became their headquarters, their warehouse, their fortress. It was there that captives were chained in cellars, their cries silenced by dirt-packed wall. Understand this. The Cannon family wasn't just a household, it was a corporation of crime. Sons-in-law, neighbors, drifters, all roped into a network that fed off human flesh. Their tavern was a facade, but their true business was industrial-scale trafficking. And Patty was at the center, the matriarch, the architect, the one who transformed family into a weapon. This is what power does. It doesn't simply corrupt the individual, it corrodes the bloodline. It spreads through kinship, through loyalty, until family itself becomes a prison. And once blood is tied to evil, escape becomes almost impossible. Kidnapping was not chaos, it was craft. Patty Cannon and her family designed it like hunters laying snares in a forest. Every move was calculated, every deception sharpened to pierce trust. And the first step was always the same: approach in disguise. They posed as labor recruiters. Good wages in Maryland, they'd say, promising steady work to free black men who dreamed of feeding their families with honest coin. Others claimed to be traveling preachers, offering sermons and charity before luring children away with promises of education. Still others played the role of sympathetic neighbors, warning of slave catchers nearby and offering their victims false safety inside Cannon's tavern. But once the doors closed, safety dissolved into silence. Chains replaced handshakes, trust curdled into terror. Some captures were violent, sudden, with victims dragged into wagons while screaming, but more often they were engineered quietly, with psychology as the weapon. The Cannons understood that control began in the mind, convincing a victim that resistance was hopeless, that no one would come for them. Families were broken deliberately, mothers separated from children, siblings sold to different plantations hundreds of miles apart. It was not only flesh they trafficked, but despair itself. The tavern became a machine for processing human lives. Victims were smuggled into its cellar, chained to iron rings in the walls. There, in the dirt-smelling dark, they were kept for days or weeks until buyers arrived. The captives could hear footsteps above them, laughter, music, the clinking of glasses, as if the world had chosen to celebrate their suffering. And when buyers came, the Cannons loaded their captives into hidden wagons with false floors, carrying them south through backwoods trails to auction blocks. Some resisted, but resistance was met with merciless punishment. Whips, starvation, shackles designed to cut flesh. Fear was cultivated like a crop. Those who fought hardest often vanished entirely. Rumors whispered of bodies dumped in shallow graves near the tavern, their names erased, their existence rewritten as if they had never walked free. Understand this: Patty Cannon's genius was not only in brute force, it was in her mastery of illusion, her ability to twist freedom into bait and kindness into a snare. Her kidnappings were not random crimes. They were a system, a business, a shadow economy that turned deception into profit and human suffering into routine. This was not survival. This was empire. By daylight, Cannon's tavern was ordinary, a weather-beaten inn, smoke curling from its chimney, wagons resting in the yard, and travelers coming and going with mugs of ale in hand. To outsiders, it was just another roadside stop along the Maryland-Delaware border, a place to rest before continuing south. But to those who lived nearby, it was something else entirely. A house where voices were heard at strange hours, where visitors vanished without explanation, and where even lawmen hesitated to knock after sundown. The tavern's design made it perfect for double lives. On the surface, it had all the trappings of frontier hospitality: a bar, a few rented rooms, laughter spilling into the night. But beneath the laughter lay a second architecture. The cellar ran deep, its walls fitted with iron rings bolted into stone, used not for storage but for shackles. Secret compartments lined the floors of wagons stored in the barn, designed to smuggle men, women, and children southward unseen. And hidden passages, rumored though never officially mapped, allowed Patty's men to move captives without the risk of prying eyes. The tavern was a theater of deception. A traveler entering the bar might find a fire roaring, music in the corner, and Patty herself, heavy-set, sharp-tongued, and quick to laugh, pouring drinks with disarming charm. Few realized that beneath their boots, in the damp cellar below, human beings sat in darkness, chained, gagged, their muffled cries drowned by the sound of fiddles and drunken conversation. For the Cannon gang, the tavern was more than home base, it was camouflage. Lawmen drank there, merchants stopped in to rest. Even local officials were said to take Patty's hospitality, looking the other way when rumors of kidnapping spread. After all, who would accuse a generous innkeeper of running an empire of shadows? The building itself seemed to breathe menace. Locals spoke of hearing chains rattling beneath the floorboards at night, even when no captives were said to be inside. Horses stabled nearby refused to go near certain corners of the barn. Children crossing the yard swore they felt watched, as though unseen faces pressed against the cellar cracks below. The tavern was not just a place. It was a mask, welcoming at first glance, sinister when understood, and terrifying when entered too deeply. And within its walls, Patty Cannon ruled as both hostess and jailer, weaving together the illusion of comfort with the reality of captivity. Patty Cannon was not beautiful, nor refined, nor gentle, and yet when she walked into a room the air shifted. She was large-boned, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by tobacco and drink, her eyes sharp as flint. Those who met her often struggled to describe her. They used words like hard, unyielding, formidable. She was not a woman to be dismissed, and that was her power. Most women of her time were confined to silence, relegated to kitchens, pews, and sewing tables. Patty rejected all of that. She smoked cigars, cursed like a dockhand, and carried pistols tucked into her bodice. Some claimed she could outdrink any man, others swore she could break a horse with her bare hands. But what truly set her apart was not strength alone. It was ruthlessness. Neighbors whispered that she enjoyed cruelty. Captives remembered her blows, her laughter at their fear, the way she would stand over chained men and women as though feeding on their helplessness. She had no qualms about striking children, no hesitation in ordering deaths. One survivor recalled her voice, rasping, amused, always in control, as she directed her men with commands as casual as ordering supper. And yet, there was another side to her, the hostess. She knew when to soften, when to play the part of a matronly innkeeper. To some travelers, she seemed almost grandmotherly, doting with a sly smile and a hearty laugh. She could charm when she needed to, masking her brutality beneath layers of warmth. This dual nature, tender on the surface, savage at her core, made her all the more terrifying. Local men feared her, not just because of her temper, but because she could make them complicit. Once you drank at her bar, once you traded favors or accepted coin from her hand, you belonged to her. She trapped men with debts, with secrets, with opportunities they dared not refuse, and if they tried to betray her, the Sinister Womp was always waiting. Bodies were found there, stripped of identity, devoured by time and water. She was not merely a criminal, she was a queen of shadows, commanding loyalty through fear and profit, manipulating both outlaws and officials alike. Her legend grew because no one knew where her power ended, how far her influence reached, or how deep her cruelty went. Patty Cannon was a paradox of her own making, a woman who became untouchable in a world designed to control women, and she wielded that freedom like a blade. It always began with a smile. Patty Cannon did not storm villages or raid homes like a bandit. No, her genius was deception. She preferred patience, cunning, and the art of a trap so subtle that by the time her victims realized, the chains were already locked around their wrists. Travelers on the road would find themselves lured to her tavern by the promise of food, a warm bed, and cheap whiskey. She made her inn appear safe, rustic, even comforting, an oasis in the treacherous swamplands of Maryland. But the comfort was a mirage. The moment a stranger crossed her threshold, she began to study them. Were they free or fugitive? Did they carry papers? Did anyone know where they were? Questions delivered with charm became snares in disguise. For children, the traps were simpler and crueler. She, or her men, would offer sweets, trinkets, or a chance to ride in a wagon. Some were snatched outright, lifted screaming from roadsides or markets. Others were lured with the promise of work, farmhands, house servants, apprenticeships. Parents were told their sons would learn a trade, their daughters would be looked after. Instead, they vanished into the Cannon household, swallowed whole by its walls. Patty was not alone in this craft. Her gang perfected the art of forgery, falsifying slave papers, altering descriptions, inventing ownership. A free black child could, on paper, be transformed into an escaped slave with nothing more than ink and a willing, corrupt official. Once the documents were in order, their fate was sealed. No protest, no appeal to law could undo it. One of her most sinister tactics was baiting trust. Survivors recounted how she feigned kindness at first, feeding the hungry, giving shelter to the tired, before the betrayal came. Imagine a child being rocked to sleep under her roof, only to wake chained in the cellar. That whiplash of care and cruelty was her UE signature. It broke the spirit before the body was sold, and always the swamp waited. Wagons left her property under cover of darkness, rolling down hidden paths only she and her men knew. By sunrise, another child, another man, another woman was gone, erased, absorbed into a market that thrived on their disappearance. Patty Cannon didn't just kidnap bodies, she kidnapped futures. She understood that terror was more profitable when it came wrapped in false safety. That was her brilliance, that was her horror. No empire of evil survives without protection. Patty Cannon understood this better than anyone. She was not merely a woman running a gang in the swamps. She was an operator plugged into a network of judges, sheriffs, and officials who chose silence over justice. Her tavern was only one layer. Behind it stood a fortress of corruption. In the early 1800s, the borderlands of Maryland and Delaware were crawling with contradictions. Laws against kidnapping existed on paper, but in practice, they were dust. Officials were often slaveholders themselves, profiting indirectly from the same commerce Patty exploited. Others were simply cowards, men unwilling to risk their careers or their lives by challenging the most feared woman in the county. Witnesses later whispered that sheriffs drank in her tavern, that judges enjoyed her hospitality, that even lawmakers avoided her name in public. When accusations arose, when a mother begged the court for her stolen son, or when free black families protested the disappearance of neighbors, the cases evaporated like morning mist. Dockets lost, evidence misplaced, witnesses discredited. Justice wasn't blind, it was bought. Some went further. Testimonies suggested she had allies who actively covered her tracks. A friendly constable could delay a search long enough for her wagons to disappear into the swamp. A clerk could adjust a birth record, erasing a child's freedom with the flick of a pen. A judge could dismiss a case as lack of proof. These were not failures of law. They were the law itself weaponized against the powerless. And yet she didn't rely only on bribes. Fear did the rest. The legend of Patty Cannon was enough to silence many who might have spoken, who would testify against a woman known for poisoning her enemies, burning farms, and disposing of bodies in pits. To cross her was to gamble with your family's safety, and so, violence spread across the counties like a disease. For nearly 2 decades, Patty operated not as an outlaw in hiding, but as a queen in plain sight. She turned corruption into her shield and the law into her accomplice. Those who disappeared under her hand were not merely victims of her gang, they were victims of a society that chose not to see. This was her true genius. Violence built her empire, but corruption kept it standing. Fear has a weight, and in the borderlands of Maryland and Delaware, that weight had a name: Patty Cannon. Her power was not only in her knives, pistols, or gangs of kidnappers. It was in the invisible chokehold she placed on the people around her. To speak her name above a whisper was to invite misfortune. To cross her was to invite death. Travelers who passed through the Nanticoke swamps told stories of her voice carrying across the marsh at night, harsh laughter echoing like a curse. Farmers claimed she rode at dawn with armed men, scanning the fields for children who strayed too far from their homes. Her victims disappeared so quickly, so completely, that parents warned their children, "Stay inside when you hear her horse, or you'll never be seen again." Even those who never laid eyes on her felt her shadow. She was invoked like a bogeyman, but unlike a myth, Patty was real. Mothers hushed restless children with her name. Drunkards sobered when she entered the tavern. Whole families avoided certain roads, certain bridges, certain times of night, not because of ghosts, but because of Patty Cannon's gang. And she encouraged this terror. She wanted her reputation to do the work her hands could not. A glare, a rumor, a whispered threat. These were her weapons as much as pistols and blades. Witnesses said she once stared down a farmer who dared to question her, and within a week his barn burned to the ground. Coincidence? No one believed it, but no one challenged her again. Even the powerful flinched. Judges and constables who might have resisted her found themselves weighed down by her reputation. A man might risk his life in a duel or a feud, but to stand against Patty was to stand against something bottomless, something that promised not just your death, but the unraveling of your family line. This is what made her reign so terrifying. Not every atrocity she committed had to be carried out. The possibility alone was enough. Silence kept her safe. Fear kept her fed, and every whispered story in every darkened house extended her reach. By the 1820s, Patty Cannon was no longer just a criminal. She was a living superstition, a force that haunted an entire region. For years, her neighbors whispered. For years, travelers carried stories of children who vanished after a stay near her tavern. But in the spring of 1829, the whispers hardened into something no one could ignore. The Cannon homestead, that squat house of timber and brick by the Nanticoke River, revealed its secrets, not in words, but in bones. It began when a tenant, searching the grounds, unearthed a skull. At first, some thought it might be an animal's, but the jawline was human, the teeth unmistakably so. Then another was found, then a half-buried femur, then ribs, scattered as though tossed away like butcher's scraps. When the sheriff's men finally searched the house itself, what they uncovered shocked even hardened officers. Behind the hearth, bricks blackened from years of fire, they found cavities stuffed with bones, small bones, children's bones, remnants of shackles rusted into the marrow. The cellar told an even darker story. A trapdoor concealed a chamber where the air was still damp and foul. Here the chains were not broken. They hung from the beams, heavy iron cuffs built for wrists too small to ever escape. Pits had been dug hastily and covered over with lime, as though the earth itself was enlisted to keep her secrets silent. Testimony later revealed that this was no isolated act. Her tavern was both a resting place and a holding pen. Runaways were hidden there before being sold south. Free black men, kidnapped from the north, were chained until transport. And those who resisted, those who drew too much attention, were silenced forever. Neighbors who had once feared to speak now remembered things, strange cries at night, the stench that sometimes rose from her fields, the way wagon wheels groaned under loads that seemed far heavier than mere barrels. Alone, each memory was just a detail. Together they painted a mural of horror. The discovery turned humor into fact, myth into nightmare. This was no ghost story. The ground around Patty Cannon's house had been drinking the blood of the disappeared for decades, and for the first time the community could not look away. She was not just a feared woman, she was the architect of a charnel house, and now the law at last could not pretend she was invisible. The arrest of Patty Cannon was not like the capture of an ordinary criminal. It was more like the breaking of a spell. For years, people had spoken her name in hushed tones, as though saying it too loudly might summon her wrath. Even men with rifles hesitated to confront her. Yet when the bones surfaced and the law could no longer feign blindness, the sheriff's men rode out. They did not come with a small party. They brought a contingent, armed men wary of both her temper and the possibility that her gang might still be lurking nearby. The tavern, once a hive of laughter, drinking, and illicit deals, stood unnervingly still. Its windows gaped like sockets in a skull. Dogs barked as the posse surrounded the house. Patty Cannon did not resist. That, perhaps, was the most unsettling part. Accounts say she appeared almost calm, her face hard but unreadable. She did not shout, did not curse, did not brandish a weapon. She simply allowed herself to be taken, as though she had always known this moment would come. Some witnesses claimed she even smiled, and that smile chilled them more than any knife. When word spread through the county that Patty Cannon was in chains, neighbors poured into the streets. Crowds gathered at the jailhouse, not out of pity, but out of morbid fascination. Men who once cowered at the mere thought of her now stood proudly, declaring they had always known she was wicked. Women clutched their children tighter, whispering prayers of relief that the devil in their midst had finally been bound. But beneath the relief lurked shame. Shame that they had ignored the cries in the night. Shame that they had seen children vanish and convinced themselves it was none of their concern. Now, with the bones unearthed, denial was no longer possible. Patty Cannon had thrived because silence had protected her, and every man and woman in the county knew it. Still, the spectacle of her downfall mesmerized them. Here was the most feared woman on the peninsula, the so-called queen of the kidnappers, now pacing behind iron bars like a caged animal. The people stared at her, half expecting her to break free, half hoping she would, because if Patty Cannon could be subdued, then perhaps their world still had order. Her arrest was not just an end, it was an exposure, and it forced the community to reckon with a question they had long avoided. How much of her power had been hers, and how much had been given to her by their silence? The trial of Patty Cannon was not a courtroom proceeding in the ordinary sense. It was more like a public exorcism. Every suppressed whisper, every hushed rumor, every nightmare that had haunted the countryside for years was suddenly dragged into the open, forced into the light of testimony. The courthouse overflowed with bodies, men who once traded with her, women who once drank in her tavern, farmers who had looked the other way, all pressed in to hear the accounts. The smell of sweat and anticipation mixed with the heavy scent of pine boards as the gavel struck. For the first time, the community would hear what Patty Cannon had done, directly, without the insulation of rumor. Witness after witness took the stand. Some were surviving victims, shaking, voices quivering, their eyes distant as though they were reliving it all over again. They spoke of being lured with promises of work, then shackled in hidden rooms beneath her house. They described children being torn from their mothers, driven in wagons toward the slave markets. Others described strange disappearances, neighbors who had simply never returned, travelers who stopped at the tavern and were never seen again. The physical evidence was undeniable. Bones had been exhumed from her property, some small enough to fit in the palm of a man's hand. Shackles were presented, rusted but real. A trapdoor leading to a concealed chamber beneath her house was displayed as proof of premeditated evil. The jurors could hardly meet one another's eyes. The community had known of her cruelty, yes, but bones and chains left no room for excuses. Patty herself sat through it all with an expression that confounded observers. Some swore she smirked as the most horrific details were read aloud, as if the suffering of others still fed her. Others said her face was stone, unreadable, as though she had already detached herself from the human drama unfolding around her. Not once did she beg for mercy. Not once did she weep. The most damning testimonies came not just from strangers, but from her accomplices, men who had once helped her traffic the innocent. In hopes of lighter sentences, they spilled every dark secret, the wagon loads of captives, the midnight sales, the threats Patty had made to keep them obedient. By the time the final witness stepped down, the courtroom was thick with dread. The people were not only hearing the crimes of Patty Cannon, they were hearing the echo of their own silence, their complicity, their cowardice. The jury did not deliberate long. How could they? The evidence was stacked like stones against her, each testimony another crushing weight. When the foreman rose to deliver the verdict, the courthouse fell into silence so complete that even the birds outside seemed to hold their song. "Guilty," he declared. Guilty of murder, guilty of kidnapping, guilty of trafficking human lives as if they were coin. The crowd did not cheer. There was no triumph in the word, only a heavy stillness, as though the community had just heard its own death sentence. For while Patty Cannon would hang, the memories of what she had done and the knowledge of how many had turned away while she thrived would never be erased. The judge pronounced her sentence, death by hanging, but Patty never gave them the spectacle. In the days that followed, she remained in her cell, silent, almost regal. The jailer would later testify that she paced at night, whispering to herself. Some swore she laughed in the dark, a low rasp that echoed down the stone corridors. Others said she was preparing, murmuring prayers, though no one could ever decide if she was speaking to God or to something far older. On the morning of her scheduled execution, the jailer arrived to find the cell unnaturally quiet. When he opened the iron door, Patty Cannon was no longer pacing. She was lying on her bunk, her eyes staring wide and glassy toward the ceiling. In her hand was the empty vial of poison. She had denied the state its justice. She had denied the community its final reckoning. She had taken her own life on her own terms. News of her death spread like wildfire. Some claimed it was cowardice. Others whispered it was her last act of defiance, that she had cheated the rope, cheated the crowd, cheated the law itself. In taverns and farmhouses, stories spread that she had made a pact long ago with something darker than Moyes and justice, and that the poison was not her end, but her doorway. Even in death, Patty Cannon had denied closure. No gallows, no crowd, no final confession, just silence, poison, and a body that refused to tell the last secret. And yet, her death did not end the terror, for the land still bore her mark, the house still stood, the graves still whispered, and the people, though relieved, could not shake the question, had they condemned a monster or simply revealed the one living inside them all along? Death should have ended her story, but with Patty Cannon, it was only the beginning. Her body was buried quickly without ceremony. No one wanted to claim her, and no minister wanted to bless the ground she touched. Some said she was laid in an unmarked grave. Others swore her corpse was carted off and hidden by fearful jailers. A few whispered her body was stolen in the night, spirited away by those who had once profited from her crimes. Wherever she lay, no one could point to her final resting place with certainty. That uncertainty became fuel for legend. Farmers along the Maryland-Delaware border claimed that her spirit walked the roads where wagons once rolled, dragging invisible chains across the dirt. Travelers at dusk reported hearing a woman's voice calling from the thickets, sweet at first, then shrill, commanding them to stop. In taverns, old men swore that horses would spook and bolt near the Cannon House, as though they sensed a presence unseen. The house itself became a wound that refused to heal. Long after Patty's death, families who moved in never stayed long. Doors slammed in the night, footsteps creaked on empty staircases. More than one child claimed to see a woman in the upstairs window, her face gaunt, her hands outstretched as though beckoning them closer. One particularly chilling tale came from a group of men who years later decided to dig near the property, hoping to find relics or treasure. What they unearthed instead were bones, small bones, too small to be anything but children. The men covered the pit in silence and left, never to return. That was when the whisper began. Patty Cannon was not gone. Her evil had seeped into the soil itself. For generations, parents used her name to frighten their children into obedience. Stay close after dark, they warned, or Patty Cannon will take you. Schoolboys dared one another to touch the doot. Of the old Cannon House at midnight, few had the courage. Those who did claimed they heard a voice hiss from within. Go back. Her legend became more than a story. It became a mirror reflecting not just one woman's crimes, but the region's unspoken history, the blood trade, the silence of neighbors, the profit made from flesh. Patty Cannon may have poisoned her own body, but her presence remained, not in spirit alone, but in memory, and memory is the one ghost that never rests. The Cannon House did not die with her. It stood like a scar, a rotting monument to cruelty. Locals avoided it, even in daylight. Its windows were hollow eyes, its walls sagging under the weight of unspoken history. Every board seemed to whisper what had been done inside. Those who dared approach spoke of a stench, faint but unmistakable, the sour mix of decay and damp earth. No matter how many seasons passed, the smell clung to the place, as though the ground itself had absorbed the secrets buried there. Travelers who lodged nearby told stories of waking in the night to screams drifting across the fields, thin and desperate, fading before they could place the sound. Children swore they saw shadows flit across the upstairs windows, even when the house was empty. Some claimed a figure would appear, a gaunt woman with sunken cheeks, always watching, never moving. The folklore deepened with each retelling. One version said Patty Cannon's spirit never left, that she paced the upper hall, searching for her next victim. Another insisted the house itself had become her prison, trapping her in the very rooms where she had spilled so much blood. Farmers tried to demolish it more than once, but the house resisted. Hammers broke against beams harder than they should have been. Fires would start but sputter out, leaving the structure blackened yet still standing. Each failed attempt only confirmed the superstition. Patty Cannon's house wanted to remain. What unsettled people most were the discoveries. When storms uprooted trees, bones would sometimes surface in the churned earth, child-sized, weathered, unmarked. A mason repairing the foundation once unearthed a skull, its jaw broken clean through. He fled the job and never returned. The land seemed determined to reveal its secrets in fragments, as if punishing those who tried to forget. The house became a pilgrimage for the curious. Adventurers came seeking thrills, only to leave pale and shaken. One group carved their names into the wall, mocking the tales, until the youngest of them fell ill days later, delirious, muttering of a woman's voice calling from his window. He wasted away within the month. His companions never spoke of the house again. The Cannon House was more than brick and timber. It was an inheritance of horror, an anchor that kept Patty Cannon's shadow alive. Even when the world outside moved forward, the house remained rooted in the past, a reminder that evil does not always die with the flesh that bore it. After her death, Patty Cannon ceased to be just a woman. She became a story, a tool. Parents in Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia used her name like a weapon, a whispered curse to keep their children obedient. If you don't behave, they warned, Patty Cannon will come for you. Her ghost loomed larger than her flesh ever had. She transformed into a figure of pure menace, the embodiment of what happens when cruelty is unchecked. No child wanted to hear her name at night. No family wanted to admit they lived near where she had walked. Yet the legend spread. It clung to the community because forgetting her was impossible. She became America's bogey woman, born not of fairy tales but of reality. Her crimes were too tangible, too fresh. Unlike mythical monsters from Europe, Patty Cannon was local, human, and terrifyingly real. Children grew up with the belief that she might still walk among them, that her presence seeped from the soil and into their dreams. Sailors carried her tale down the coast, embellishing details until she seemed supernatural. Some said she could slip through locked doors, dragging the disobedient into her cellar. Others swore her chains rattled in the dark woods at night, searching for new captives. The more impossible the stories became, the more they stuck, because they were rooted in truth, the truth that Patty Cannon had been worse than fiction. Even churches joined in the ritual. Preachers invoked her as a cautionary figure, proof that sin bred damnation, and that God's judgment, though delayed, was inevitable. Children sat trembling in pews as ministers thundered her name, turning her into both villain and sermon. Generations later, her legend did not fade, it mutated. Farmers still told their sons not to wander near the old Cannon property. Mothers still used her as a threat, their voices hushed, as though speaking too loudly might summon her spirit. For the communities she scarred, the fear was not just of her memory, but of inheritance, that the soil might breed more like her. Patty Cannon had achieved what few criminals ever could. She outlived her body. Through folklore, she became immortal, her name etched not only in court records but in the psychology of generations. And yet, beneath the stories there lingered an unease. Folklore can exaggerate, distort, even lie, but in her case the most horrifying detail was this: no tale ever matched the reality. The truth of what she had done was darker than the legend. Patty Cannon's life ended in a prison cell, but her shadow stretched far beyond that narrow space. To see her only as a single woman's cruelty is to miss the deeper truth. She was not just a criminal, she was a symptom. A reflection of what America was willing to tolerate, conceal, and even protect when profit and power were at stake. The brutal reality is this: Patty Cannon thrived because society allowed her to. Judges, sheriffs, and slave traders all looked the other way. She was not an outsider clawing at the edges of civilization. She was woven into its fabric. Her gang operated in plain sight for years, moving human lives like cattle, while neighbors pretended not to hear the cries. That silence was not ignorance, it was complicity. Her legacy forces us to confront a truth Americans often prefer to bury. The greatest horrors are never committed by monsters hiding in the shadows. They are committed by people who know the system, exploit its cracks, and smile in public while blood runs in private. Patty Cannon was the face of that truth. She showed how cruelty could become an industry, how violence could be turned into wealth, and how silence from those around her was the strongest weapon she possessed. The folklore of her ghost haunting children may have kept her alive in imagination, but the real haunting is different. It lies in the uncomfortable fact that she was not unique. She was part of a larger machine of control, a hidden economy of fear and profit. Her name survived because she embodied something America instinctively knew but could not say aloud: that the line between respectability and barbarity is thinner than anyone dares admit. Even now, when her name is whispered in small towns, it carries more than superstition. It carries guilt. It carries the reminder that a community can bury its dead, but it cannot bury its silence. Patty Cannon remains not just a ghost story, but a warning that behind every legend is a truth society tried and failed to erase. In the end, Patty Cannon's tale is not about one woman's sins. It is about the darkness a nation permits when its people look away. And that darkness, once unleashed, never truly dies.